You step forward to begin, but your body tightens instead. Your hands stay still, your breath shortens, and nothing starts. That hesitation is not weakness, it is the absence of structure. This is where discipline is built through repetition, not intention. The floor of the training hall is cold under your feet. Shoulders tense. Jaw tight. You are not deciding whether to act, you are waiting to feel ready. And that waiting stretches just long enough for resistance to take control. The body delays, not because it cannot move, but because nothing forces it to. Without structure, every action becomes optional. And optional actions collapse under pressure. Your family watches this pattern from a distance. They don't see the missed repetitions. They only see inconsistency. To them, it looks like lack of commitment. To you, it feels like something harder to name. But the truth is simpler. There is no system holding you in place when resistance arrives, the moment structure should have been there. There is no system holding you in place when resistance arrives. So the moment stretches. Your shoulders stay tight. Fingers slightly curled, but inactive. The floor remains cold beneath your feet, but you don't shift your weight forward. The movement is simple. It has been done before. But without a fixed sequence, the body waits for a signal that never comes. This is where discipline begins to break, not in failure, but in delay. You tell yourself it will start in a second. Just one more breath. Just one small adjustment. The mind looks for a reason to move, but the body searches for a reason not to. And because nothing is defined, both sides stall. The training hall remains silent. No command. No enforced start. Only you, suspended between intention and action. That space is where structure should exist. Without it, the body negotiates based on comfort. The tension in your shoulders becomes a valid excuse. The cold air in your lungs becomes a reason to wait. The absence of urgency becomes permission to delay. And delay compounds into absence. You don't skip completely. You just don't begin on time. And that distinction feels small enough to ignore. But repetition does not ignore it. Each delayed start rewrites the pattern. Each hesitation teaches the body that action is optional. And once optional, discipline cannot stabilize. From the outside, it looks like inconsistency. Your family sees the pattern but not the cause. They notice the irregular timing, the incomplete sessions, the quiet drop in repetition. They assume a lack of seriousness. They don't see the exact moment where the structure fails, because that moment is invisible. It happens before movement. It happens in the gap. And in that gap, the body begins to follow the shortest path to relief. Not the correct path. Not the intended path. The easiest one. This is the effect of short-term reward bias when no structure is present. The body is not resisting effort entirely, it is prioritizing immediate comfort over delayed consistency. The system does not exist to override that bias, so the bias becomes the system. You feel it clearly. The first step feels heavier than it should. The breath feels tighter than necessary. The posture is slightly off, not because it cannot be corrected, but because nothing forces the correction. So the standard drops, quietly. Not enough to alarm you. Just enough to weaken the sequence. Without a minimum baseline, there is no floor. Without a floor, every action depends on condition. And condition changes constantly: temperature, mood, tension, small distractions, unseen fatigue. Each variable becomes a reason to adjust, delay, or reduce. And once adjustment becomes normal, structure disappears completely. You are no longer following a system. You are negotiating with conditions. That negotiation happens every time you step forward. Every repetition becomes a question instead of a command. And questions slow the body down. The training hall does not enforce anything. It simply reflects what you bring into it. And what you bring is instability, not because you lack discipline, but because nothing is fixed enough to hold it. So the hesitation remains. And it grows familiar, when familiar delay becomes default. And it grows familiar. So familiar that you stop recognizing it as failure. Your body settles into the delay as if it belongs there. Shoulders still tight, but now unmoving. Breath shallow, controlled, but not preparing for action, just maintaining the pause. The floor beneath your feet hasn't changed, but your posture has. You are no longer about to begin. You are already not beginning. This is how structure disappears completely, without noise. There is no dramatic collapse. No clear moment where you decide to stop. Instead, the delay stretches slightly longer each time. The first second becomes 2. 2 becomes 5. And eventually, the start itself becomes negotiable. The body learns this pattern quickly. It does not need instruction. It only needs repetition. You step into the same training hall, at the same time, but nothing inside the sequence is fixed. No first movement is locked. No starting signal is enforced. So the body waits for internal approval again. And again, it doesn't come. Because it doesn't have to. Short-term reward bias tightens its grip here. The body recognizes that not starting brings immediate relief, less tension, less effort, less discomfort. That relief is small, but it is instant. And instant always wins when nothing is structured to oppose it. So the system becomes inverted. Instead of action being automatic, avoidance becomes automatic. Your hands remain at your sides longer than they should. Your stance never fully sets. The first repetition feels distant, like something optional rather than required. And without a minimum baseline to force even the smallest action, nothing interrupts that drift. From the outside, it looks like hesitation. From the inside, it feels reasonable. You tell yourself the session will still happen. Just not yet. Just after the tension drops. Just after the body feels ready. But readiness never arrives, because readiness is not a condition, it is a consequence of movement. Without movement, nothing shifts. Your family notices the inconsistency more clearly now. They see you enter the space, linger, adjust, step back. They don't understand why something so simple takes so long to begin. Questions form, even if they are not spoken directly. Why is it always delayed? Why does it look like nothing is happening? They interpret what they see. And what they see is a person who cannot hold a line. But the truth is not about holding a line. It is about not having one. Without structure, there is nothing to hold. Every repetition becomes dependent on internal alignment, how the body feels, how the mind settles, how the moment presents itself. And those variables shift constantly. So the outcome shifts with them. Some days you start quickly. Other days you don't start at all. There is no consistency because there is no system enforcing it. The cold tension in your body becomes more noticeable the longer you stand still. Muscles stiffen further. Breath stays tight. The discomfort you were trying to avoid by delaying begins to grow anyway, but now without purpose. This is the cost of unstructured delay. You don't escape resistance. You extend it. And the longer it extends, the harder the first movement becomes. So the body adapts again. It reduces expectation. It lowers intensity before even beginning. It prepares for a weaker session to compensate for the delayed start. And just like that, the standard drops again, without being acknowledged. Because nothing in your system is fixed enough to resist that drop, the internal war without structure. Because nothing in your system is fixed enough to resist that drop, the conflict does not stay external. It moves inward and tightens. Your body remains in that same cold tension, shoulders locked, neck slightly stiff, breath controlled but shallow. But now the resistance is no longer just delay. It becomes argument. You feel it immediately. Start now. Wait a little longer. Just adjust your stance first. It's not the right moment yet. The thoughts are small, quiet, but they repeat with precision. Not random hesitation, patterned negotiation. This is the internal war that structure is supposed to eliminate. Without a fixed starting point, every action must be approved again. And approval is never neutral. It is filtered through comfort, through immediate reward, through the body's preference to remain where it is. So the conflict repeats, cycle after cycle. You lean forward slightly, then stop. You tighten your grip, then release it. You inhale deeper, then hold. Each micro movement suggests action, but none of them complete it. Because nothing forces completion. In a structured system, this moment does not exist. The body moves because it is time. The sequence begins because it is already defined. There is no space for argument because there is no decision to make. But here, in the absence of structure, every repetition becomes a debate. And debate consumes time. The longer it continues, the more the body aligns with the side that offers relief. Not discipline. Not intention. Relief. Short-term reward bias does not need to win completely. It only needs to delay long enough to weaken the action. And once weakened, the entire session shifts. You finally step forward, but slower than before. The movement lacks sharpness. The first repetition begins, but it carries the residue of hesitation. The body is already compromised. And that compromise spreads. Your stance is slightly off. Your timing is slightly late. Your focus is slightly divided. Nothing collapses completely. But nothing is exact. This is how discipline erodes without structure, not through failure, but through deviation. From the outside, it still looks like effort. Your family sees movement now. They see you finally begin. To them, it appears that you pushed through. But they don't see what changed inside the sequence. They don't see that the starting point moved. They don't see that the standard lowered before the first action. They don't see that the system is gone. So they assume progress. But progress requires consistency. And consistency cannot exist without fixed structure. The training hall does not correct you. It only reflects what you bring. And what you bring is still unstable, because every repetition is built on a different starting point. Some begin late. Some begin weak. Some begin with hesitation still present in the body. There is no single line being followed. And without a line, there is no accumulation. You are repeating actions, but not the same action. And repetition without sameness does not build discipline. It builds variation. The internal war continues because nothing has replaced it. Every session resets the argument. Every start reopens the negotiation. Every movement carries a trace of compromise. And over time, that compromise becomes the norm, where structure replaces the argument. And over time, that compromise becomes the norm, until something interrupts it. Your body stands in the same place, tension still present, shoulders tight, breath controlled but shallow. The difference is not in how you feel. The difference is in what happens next. You step forward. Not because the tension disappeared. Not because the timing feels right. But because the sequence no longer asks for permission. This is where structure enters. The first movement is no longer negotiable. It is fixed. The moment you reach the floor, your feet align. The moment your feet align, your stance sets. The moment your stance sets, the first repetition begins. There is no gap. The body still resists. The cold tension remains in your joints. Your breath still catches slightly at the start. But the system does not recognize those signals as valid inputs. It ignores them. Because the sequence has already decided. This is the function of a minimum baseline system. It does not demand optimal performance. It demands uninterrupted continuation. No matter how the body feels, the first action must occur. And once it occurs, the second follows. Not because you are motivated. Not because you overcame resistance. But because the sequence leaves no space between steps. The internal war begins to collapse here, not by force, but by removal. There is nothing left to argue about. The thought still appears, delay, adjust, wait. But it has no place to land. The body is already moving. The stance is already set. The repetition is already in motion. And motion does not negotiate. Your family watches again, but the pattern has changed. There is no visible hesitation now. No standing still at the edge. No prolonged adjustment. The start is immediate. They don't understand why. From their perspective, it looks like discipline finally appeared. But what they are seeing is not discipline in the way they think. It is structure removing the need for it. You are not choosing to begin anymore. You are following. The training hall feels the same cold floor, same air, same silence. But the experience inside it is different. The moment you enter, the sequence activates. Not in thought, but in behavior. Feet align. Stance sets. First movement executes. There is no variation in the starting point. And because the starting point is fixed, everything that follows begins to stabilize. Your body still carries tension, but it no longer controls timing. Your breath is still tight, but it no longer delays action. The discomfort is present, but it is irrelevant. Because the system has removed its authority. This is what was missing before. Not effort. Not intention. Not awareness. Structure. Without it, every repetition depended on your condition. With it, condition becomes secondary. You still feel resistance. But now resistance happens inside movement, not before it. And the distinction changes everything. The standard no longer drops before the first action. It is enforced by the sequence itself. Even on days where the body is slower, the baseline remains intact. The first step happens. Always. And once that is guaranteed, the rest of the session no longer depends on negotiation, when structure holds under pressure. And once that is guaranteed, the rest of the session no longer depends on negotiation. But pressure does not disappear. It shifts. Your body still carries that same cold tension. The stiffness in your shoulders does not dissolve. Your breath is still slightly restricted, expanding only as much as needed, never fully relaxed. The difference is that none of it interrupts the sequence anymore. The repetitions continue. Not clean at first. Not sharp. But continuous. This is where structure is tested, not in ideal conditions, but in resistance that remains present. Your stance holds, even when the body wants to loosen it. Your timing stays consistent, even when your breath lags behind. Each movement follows the last, not because it feels right, but because it is already defined. The minimum baseline is doing its work. Even at reduced intensity, the sequence does not break. Even when the body drifts slightly off, the next repetition corrects it, not through thought, but through continuation. This is the difference between controlled inconsistency and enforced continuity. Before, the session depended on how you felt at the start. Now, the session survives regardless of how it begins. Your family notices something else now. The hesitation is gone, but so is any visible fluctuation. There are no pauses long enough to question. No gaps where doubt becomes visible. The session looks the same each time. That sameness creates discomfort. They don't say it directly, but it's there, in the way they watch without commenting, in the slight pause before asking unrelated questions, in the quiet confusion of seeing something repeat without change. Why do you do it like this every time? The question carries more than curiosity. It carries misunderstanding. Because from their perspective, variation means progress. Adjustment means intelligence. Flexibility means control. But what they are seeing is something else entirely. They are seeing a system that does not adjust to comfort. And that makes them uneasy. You hear the question, but it does not enter the sequence. The body continues. The repetition does not pause to respond. The system does not create space for explanation. Because explanation is another form of delay. This is where social friction meets structure. Not as confrontation, but as quiet separation. They expect responsiveness. You maintain repetition. They expect variation. You maintain sequence. They expect engagement. You maintain execution. And over time, that difference becomes visible. Not through words. Through pattern. The session begins the same way. It continues the same way. It ends without collapse. Every time. The body still resists in small ways. A slight hesitation in one movement. A minor drop in sharpness. A breath that tightens unexpectedly. But none of it stops the flow. Because stopping is no longer part of the system. That is the critical shift. Before, resistance interrupted action. Now, resistance exists inside action without changing it. And because of that, repetition begins to accumulate. Not perfectly, but consistently. And consistency, once stabilized, does something the earlier system never could. It removes doubt about whether the action will happen at all. When structure removes future failure, it removes doubt about whether the action will happen at all. And once that doubt is gone, something else begins to disappear with it, the possibility of collapse. Your body still carries resistance. The cold tension does not leave. Your shoulders remain slightly rigid, your breath still measured and controlled. But now those signals no longer influence what happens next. Because the next step is already decided. The sequence does not wait for confirmation anymore. It does not adjust to discomfort. It does not scan for better conditions. It executes what has already been defined. This is where structure extends beyond the present moment. Before, every repetition had to be earned again. Every session could fail before it began. Every day reset the uncertainty. Now, the uncertainty is removed in advance. The moment you enter the training hall, the outcome is already determined, not in quality, but in occurrence. The baseline will happen. The sequence will begin. The repetitions will continue. Not because you are stronger. Because the system has eliminated the alternative. There is no path where you stand still. No version where you delay long enough to stop. No option where you reduce the session to nothing. Even on a day where your body feels heavier, where your breath tightens earlier, where your movements lack precision, the baseline remains untouched. You begin. You continue. You finish. Always. This is what was missing before. Not effort. Not awareness. Not intention. Pre-decided continuation. Your family notices the consistency now, but they begin to question it differently. The confusion shifts into something closer to discomfort. You never skip anymore? Don't you ever feel like stopping? The question is genuine, but it reveals something important. They are still operating under a system where stopping is an available option. You are not. The difference is no longer in motivation. It is in design. They expect discipline to fluctuate because their structure allows fluctuation. You no longer experience that fluctuation because your system has removed the conditions that create it. You hear the questions, but they don't enter your process. Not because you ignore them, but because there is no place for them inside the sequence. The repetition continues. Each movement follows the last. Not perfectly, but consistently. The body adapts to the pattern. The breath stabilizes within motion. The tension becomes part of the environment, not a signal to stop. This is where structure begins to shape identity. Not through belief, not through intention, through repetition that does not break. The internal conflict that wants to find the start of every session, the hesitation, the delay, the negotiation, has no function anymore. It still appears in fragments, but it no longer controls behavior. Because behavior is already assigned. And when behavior is assigned, failure loses its entry point. There is no moment left where collapse can begin. Only continuation, when structure becomes identity. Only continuation. And when continuation holds long enough, it stops feeling like effort. Your body still carries traces of resistance, tight shoulders, controlled breath, slight stiffness and movement. But none of it registers as a signal anymore. It exists, but it no longer interrupts. It no longer delays. It no longer negotiates. Because the sequence has replaced the question entirely. You step into the training hall, and there is no moment of pause. No scanning of the body. No internal check for readiness. The floor meets your feet, and the first movement begins without interruption. Not forced. Not pushed. Expected. The cold air, the tension in your muscles, the slight resistance in your joints, these are no longer obstacles. They are constants. And constants do not require adjustment. The sequence runs. Feet align. Stance sets. First repetition executes. There is no awareness of starting anymore. Only continuation from the moment you arrive. This is where the shift becomes visible, not in intensity, not in performance, but in predictability. Your family sees it clearly now. The pattern does not change. There is no delay. No variation in how the session begins. No visible negotiation. The same sequence, at the same moment, every time. It becomes difficult for them to question it. Not because they understand it, but because it no longer presents weakness. The earlier hesitation gave them something to interpret. Something to comment on. Something to doubt. But this consistency removes all visible instability. And in its place, something else appears. Distance. They do not interrupt as often. They do not ask the same questions. The misunderstanding remains, but it no longer interferes. The pattern has become too stable to disrupt casually. Because it no longer depends on explanation. It depends on repetition. Inside the sequence, your body adapts further. Movements no longer require adjustment at the start. The stance forms without correction. The timing settles into a consistent rhythm. Not perfect, but uniform. This is where routine begins to feel default. Not something you enforce. Not something you maintain. Something that happens the same way every time without requiring attention. The internal conflict that wants to find the beginning, the short-term pull toward comfort, the subtle desire to delay, the quiet negotiation, has no entry point left. It cannot interrupt the start. It cannot delay the first action. It cannot weaken the sequence before it begins. Because the beginning no longer exists as a decision. It exists as a condition. You arrive, and the system activates. No discussion. No adjustment. No variation. The repetition continues exactly as it has been defined. And over time, that repetition stops feeling like something you are doing. It becomes something you are. Not in thought. Not in identity statements. In behavior that does not change. Structure no longer supports discipline. Structure becomes discipline. Structure becomes discipline. And once that happens, the question of whether you will act no longer exists. Your body still carries resistance. The tension has not disappeared. The breath still tightens at the start. The cold remains in the floor beneath your feet. But none of it changes the sequence anymore. You arrive, and the system executes. There is no hesitation to overcome. No decision to make. No condition to evaluate. The first movement begins because it is already defined. The repetition continues because it is already assigned. This is the point where discipline stops depending on strength. It depends on structure. Without it, you were negotiating every step. You delayed, adjusted, and weakened the sequence before it even began. The body followed comfort because nothing prevented it. With structure, that pathway is closed. There is no space left for delay. No room for reduction. No version where the session disappears before it starts. The minimum baseline holds everything in place, even when the body resists. And because it holds, repetition accumulates. Not perfectly, not intensely, but consistently. That consistency removes instability. And when instability disappears, discipline no longer needs to be enforced. It remains. This is no longer something you decide to do. It is what happens when you arrive.